Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the Roundtable number 44, and I am joined today by Clayton Morris, formerly of the evil MSM, but now he's on the side of the angels, thankfully. Clayton, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on once again. And how have you been
Pleasure.
doing? And what do you think of the whole shit show that's going on insofar as Ukraine is concerned?
I've been doing well. I've, on a personal level, just, it was good to take some downtime during the holidays. And I think for a lot of us who are knee deep in this kind of stuff on a regular basis, it can really, really gets to you. And I think we need to sometimes step back from it and reconnect. I know you had taken some time with your family a little while, and so it's just like to be able to take some time and to reconnect. So on a personal level and just seeing where we are geopolitically, I have more hope, I have to say. I think that we're starting to see some, there's a lot. I think there was a big difference this World Economic Forum in Davos than there was last time. I think there's much more awareness about what these globalists are doing to us. So I'm heartened. I'm heartened by some of the mainstream media coverage around what these globalists are doing. It was a different tone this time. There was lower turnout numbers at this thing. There were people that mysteriously said they couldn't make it, that they had other commitments. What other commitments do you have if you're George Soros that you can't go to the World Economic Forum? Like, this is your thing, right? So I have other commitments. I can't make it. So there were some mysterious things. But I'm heartened about that. So, I'm excited this year to really kind of keep pushing further against this narrative, really trying to open people's eyes. And, thank you for the work you're doing. So I'm heartened in that way, just at a 30,000 foot level about this. And all the people watching right now, like, this is so important, to be able to share these things out with people and get this message out. So just at a 30,000 foot level, that's how I'm doing. And that's how I'm feeling, I guess, today.
Well, you're a much more hopeful man than I am, I suppose, because unfortunately for the holidays, I wasn't able to be with any of my family or anything like that. It just slid by because I'm stuck here. But and frankly, I've become extremely nervous. I agree with you, by the way. The Davos turnout was a lot lower, and I think that basically over the past year or 2 years, perhaps, so many people have become so aware of the WEF. I mean, their marketing of this elite congregation it has been so successful that it's played against them, because I think a lot of people decided, I don't really want to go, and I'm going to try to distance myself from Ernest Blofeld, or excuse me, Klaus Schwab,
right?
Because it is a little bit like the Emperor Palpatine, Soros, and meeting up with Ernst Blofeld, and it creeped people out. And I think that they themselves are starting to realize that this publicity. They always say that there's no such thing as bad publicity, but there is. There comes a point where it's just not good for you. And I know some people who have previously attended the WEF, and they were like, no, it just seems like a shit show. And also, a couple of people that I know personally that I interacted with via email directly, they were worried about alt media congregating on the WEF, and that's exactly what happened. The Rebel News was there. And they corralled Greta Thunberg, Schwab, and I forget the third that they corralled there.
Albert Bourla of Pfizer.
Yeah,
I mean, by the way,
walk and talk. Yeah.
So Avi Yemeni from Rebel News, and we featured that on our show this week, and we praise, this is where you've got to support independent media, right? Because of all the credentialed media that were there, and we can, and let me just say at the outset, I agree with you. Like, we'll get more into where I'm feeling dark and upset and really nervous, quite honestly, and anxious. And as we look at what's unfolding in Russia and the energy crisis that's unfolding before us, so we can talk about that. But just at the World Economic Forum piece, you have Avi Yemeni from Rebel News and Ezra Levant, who were like walking with Albert Bourla, just asking questions nonstop for like 15 minutes. And it was an amazing piece of video. This morning, Avi tweeted that, in fact, YouTube has now banned the video. Facebook has banned the video. Instagram has banned the video. Twitter still has the video up and available. So you can still see it there. We featured it on our show as well, and but it's amazing. So of course Pfizer doesn't want this video out there. They don't want these questions of their CEO being asked. And the only way you got these questions was from independent media, right? Because the credentialed media that was there, CNBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, they're not asking these questions. They're kissing the ass of these people. That's how they get access. Right. They are mouthpieces. They are mouthpieces of these people. And they want to have access. They would be shut out, scorned if they started asking tough questions. PBS, I don't know that PBS was there. Remember, PBS was asking tough questions of Bill Gates. Yeah, but they, at least Judy Woodruff was asking tough questions of Bill Gates, and I don't know if PBS was there or had access. And I know that there was quite a bit of blowback of Judy Woodruff asking questions about Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein. Like, you don't ask those questions if you're the mainstream media.
But you were in the mainstream media with Fox News, right? Mm-hmm. And what was your experience? Because this is as an outsider to mainstream media. My notion is that a lot of these people decide that they are going to, in order to get access to these big names that can provide them with information, sometimes insider information, they are willing mouthpieces. And so, like, it's a trade. I'm an important person. You're a journalist. I'll talk to you and give you some, background information that might help you in some other story. But you have to say my bullshit. Is that basically how it works out? It's basically a quid pro quo.
Let me unpack that a little bit. I think it may be more nuanced than that, but in my experience, my personal experience, I worked on a morning show for 10 years at Fox News. And so we would, on the one hand, have the guy who just had the world's biggest record for eating croissants on the show, Okay,
and then I can get behind that. That.
And then in the next block, I'd be interviewing Donald Trump. That's the kind of show it was, right? Where one minute I'm interviewing a senator, the next minute I'm interviewing the guy that has eaten 20 hot dogs at Coney Island. That's it's a morning show, right? So for 4 hours I'm on the air.
Yeah, it's news and entertainment. That's natural,
right?
Yeah.
And I never had anyone say to me, we want you to talk like this or think this way, right? But of course, if you're at a conservative network, the stories, the segments that you're going to do are produced a certain way, and they have the guests that are related to that segment are going to further that talking point, right? So, that's exactly the people you're going to have on the show, kind of furthering that talking point. It was rare on our show for us to have much of a debate about anything. Having said that, at other networks, I know people that have worked at these other networks. It's absolutely been the case where you've had people, specifically CNN, right, where you literally have people in the newsroom who are former members of the intelligence state, who are literally handing information, like, that Jim Sciutto guy at CNN, who had all kinds of, surprising access inside of Ukraine, was one of those individuals who, was telling us he had all sort of wherewithal and information about the advancement that was about to unfold from Ukraine, this major offensive that was about to unfold from Ukraine. Remember that from Jim Sciutto from CNN? And he published, like, it's going to happen here. It's going to look like this. This is coming from my intelligence sources.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You kind of froze up and then went dark for a minute, so I just kept talking. Can you guys hear?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello?
Gotcha. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah, I hear you fine. Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. My internet dropped out, and there's really nothing I can do about it. Sorry about that, chat. And I hope you didn't talk about me and my drug addiction and the thing with the goats and all that stuff. No. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I would never talk about behind someone's back. I'll let you.
You were on air, so it'd be technically, I'm sorry about that, chat. I'm so sorry about that. I couldn't help it. So you were saying.
Yeah, no, I was saying, and I'm not sure what you heard. I was just talking about how no one ever at Fox ever told me to say anything. When I was hired by Fox and Roger Ailes, his words were to me, just be yourself. And that's all I ever was. I tried to have fun on that morning show, and I tried not to delve too deeply into politics first thing in the morning. I didn't think people really wanted that. But I will say that at CNN and other networks, absolutely, there's an agenda for this. And that they're being handed things from the intelligence state. So, for instance, Jim Sciutto. Hey, Alex.
Hello, Clayton. Good to see you.
Pleasure. I'll step aside, but I was just saying Jim Sciutto, remember, at CNN, who
No,
was
don't step
literally
aside.
we were just talking about mainstream media and specifically talking about how how the intelligence state hands mainstream media people information in the 1970s. Of course, it used to be that they had to infiltrate newsrooms. The CIA, the deep state, would infiltrate newsrooms, right? And we didn't know technically who they were. Now they're just on the payroll. Now they'll turn to former head of the CIA, et cetera, is now on the CNN payroll, and now there's no hiding it anymore. And so when Jim Sciutto goes out there and does a story about he knows exactly how Ukraine is going to launch this offensive, and here's X, Y, and Z, I've been told by intelligence sources. Of course, he's a darling of the intelligence community, so that's how CNN gets access, is because they mouthpiece and parrot these exact stories. Barbara Starr is a perfect example, who just retired. Parroting all of the garbage in Syria, parroting, lies in Ukraine. I mean, the list is endless for these people in the mainstream media and what they do. So that's my rant about the mainstream media.
Now, Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. I greatly appreciated you being on, and I wanted to introduce you two guys because I don't think that you guys have ever interacted before, have you?
I don't think so. No,
No, we haven't interacted, which is a great shame. Actually, it's very strange because, of course, I follow your videos regularly, your programs, your commentaries, Clayton, and I have to say I'm somebody who has a huge respect for your work. And,
likewise.
Gonzalo, thank you for bringing us together. Now, I should say I'm not going to be able to stay for very long. In fact, about 20 minutes max, but I just I would say thank you, Gonzalo, and thank you, Clayton.
My pleasure.
Here I am for what it's worth.
Well,
it's worth a lot. It's a pleasure.
Since we've got the Oracle of London here, what do you think of the whole Ramstein thing? Because that's a topic that Clayton and I were going to segue into, about how they're basically gearing up for more weapons, not just tanks now, but the Dutch have talked about F-16s, and they're gearing up insofar as NATO is concerned.
Right, there's two stories I think about Ramstein. One is the fact that they're doing exactly what you said, and I think we have to understand why, and that is that the situation in Ukraine is going horribly wrong. If it was going well, they wouldn't need to do what they're doing, but they even the British Ministry of Defence has just recently published a message on Twitter in which they admit that Bakhmut is going wrong. Things are going wrong, despite the fact, by the way, Clayton, that in Britain the media here is even more conformist and even more following the line the government is taking, if possible, than in the United States. Every so often in the United States you see a glimmer of a voice somewhere that says, maybe this isn't such a great idea, or maybe we ought to rethink these things. And of course, in the United States you have this enormous wealth of magazines, websites, military websites run by military people. We don't have anything analogous here in Britain, and that's a thing to always understand. So we have a much more uniform voice about the war, but even here, it's sort of breaking through that things are not going well. So on the one hand, escalate, send more weapons, send more tanks, send more infantry fighting vehicles, send more drones, send more fighter jets. But so, hello. Am I still here? Yes, I am.
Yes, you were just talking about send more fighter jets
send fighter jets. Yes. Yeah. So that's one aspect of Ramstein. The other, however, and it's a serious one, it's an important one, is that you're starting to see the uniformed military in various NATO states starting to say, look, this is going too far. It's going horribly wrong. We can't go on like this. So we've had a whole succession of German generals, including the the former Inspector General of the German Army. In other words, it's equivalent to the Chief of Staff. He's come out, he's given a very powerful interview. General Kuyat, who said, this is crazy, sending tanks to Ukraine at this time is wrong. It's not going to work. You've had General Milley saying, this is the moment for negotiations, not for escalating the war. you're starting to see things. Am I getting through? Am I getting through? And
Yeah.
there's also I mean, these are not rumors. It is a fact that apparently the BND, the German intelligence service, which incidentally is not part of the Five Eyes system, has now apparently provided a report to the Bundestag, the German parliament, in which they've said this isn't going well and the war isn't going well. And there might not be very much sense ultimately. I mean, that's what they said, but it's the implication of throwing more weapons and more things into this war because it's becoming increasingly dangerous. I mean, if we just yeah, if we start overcommitting, then the risk we run is we get into a escalation. And one of these German generals, General Fudd, who is Angela Merkel's former advisor, he actually said, we could find ourselves one morning in World War III. So you see that the military is starting to rebel, especially in Germany. I'm sure this played a big role in the German decision in Ramstein to refuse to provide tanks. The pressure on the Germans to say yes to that has been enormous. Over the next couple of weeks, it's going to grow. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. It'll be interesting to see whether Germany cracks on this. I would put money on the fact that it ultimately will. We see German public opinion, according to opinion polls, is starting to turn against the war. So that's basically the story of Ramstein, in my opinion. In a sense, it's push and pull. It's the unstoppable force for escalation meeting the perhaps not entirely immovable obstacle, which is the uniformed military saying this is not a good idea and let's push back. I think it was important, even if it doesn't continue for very long, that Germany said basically no when it was asked to provide the tanks at Ramstein. I mean, even if they say yes in a week or 2 weeks or a month, the fact that they did actually stand up in Ramstein and say no is an indication of the fact that the doubts there are growing.
You talked about the idea of waking up on World War III. Can I just ask kind of a crazy, blunt question, which is, aren't we already in World War III?
Yeah, I know. Well, you're absolutely right. And more people are, of course, saying this. Of course, when people talk about World War III, they talk about, missiles being launched and nuclear weapons being launched. In fact, what is happening is that we are in a kind of it's not a phony war, it's a very real war, but it's a World War III that is being fought out at many levels: military, economic, geopolitical, diplomatic. And it's a struggle, a raw struggle, like we've never seen at any time since the end of the Second World War. But it hasn't yet crossed that line where NATO forces and Russian forces are straightforwardly and openly fighting each other. And of course, if we do get there, then that will answer even, the people who want to pretend that we're not in World War III type scenarios. It will be a World War III type scenario, which everybody acknowledges.
Yeah, I mean,
because
well,
my thinking is that.
Go ahead,
sorry
Zed.
about that. And
Go
by the
ahead.
way,
No,
sorry
go.
about the
Please.
internet. No, my thinking is that starting in February 24th, definitely this is World War III, and it's being fought on Ukrainian soil, but it's not Ukraine-Russia, it's NATO-Russia.
No.
It's the collective West, not just against Russia, but against Russia-China, and Russia really, U.S. NATO really pretty much against the rest of the world, because quite apart from the kinetic aspect and the economic sanctions aspect, you've had all these color revolutions that have been going on around the world. And especially as of late, I mean, in 2020, they tried to overthrow the Lukashenko regime. In January of 2022, people have forgotten about the Kazakhstan situation. That was basically a color revolution. It's very much, to me, it seems that the declining American empire, the leadership class recognizes that their grip on power is slipping, and they're lashing out in all directions. And it's not so much that they truly believe that China is going to invade Alaska or California, or that the Russians are going to make it to London. No, it's really desperation at losing their grip on power, and so that they're lashing out in an indiscriminate way. And interestingly enough, in a non-strategic way, because everything that they do is ad hoc. Everything they do is improvised. It's sort of like geopolitical jazz, which is horrifying because you don't know where the consequences will wind up. I mean, how far things can escalate, because sort of like you go in one direction and that doesn't work, so you go in another and you double down. As Alexander always says, the neocons who are running this show, because they're the ones who are really behind this nonsense, they don't have a reverse gear. They can only double down. And now they're seeing the situation in Ukraine and they're doubling down, and there's no end to this. That's my thinking at this point. What do you gentlemen think?
No, I think this is exactly correct. They're making it up as they go along, because I think the original plan, which was a very simple one, but it failed. And I think this is an important thing to understand. I mean, we are very fixated on the military conflict, the fighting that's going on in Ukraine. But in some respects, that was not intended to be the really big conflict. It was the sanctions war. It was the expectation that, you impose the sanctions, you freeze the Russian central bank's assets, you disconnect Russia from SWIFT, you impose all these restrictions on their energy exports. And the universal expectation was that the Russian economy would collapse, that it would collapse like a house of cards. And of course, that hasn't happened. So that was plan A. And the failure of plan A and what was expected to be the sequel to the success of plan A, which is some kind of political crisis in Russia, was that, you have to move now to plan B, which is you have to now try and find some kind of military outcome which is working to your advantage. But the trouble with plan B is that it's not easy to control. So you're trapped, in a sense, if you can't give up on this, in a cycle of escalation. So firstly, you send javelins and stingers, then you send artillery, then you send HIMARS rockets, then you send tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Now you're talking about fighter jets, things that you always said publicly that you wouldn't do, but you end up doing it because you're still so invested in this project that you can't pull back. And of course, if you pull back, then of course you have to face up to the fact that this massive investment that you put into this project is lost. And that might have political consequences as well. So always the temptation is do something more, send tanks, send aircraft, send machines, perhaps squeeze the sanctions a little more, come up not with one cap on the oil, but two caps on the oil, come up with a cap on the gas. Do all of this. Eventually, you hope that something will happen and that the other side will break. And of course, the risk is that you're actually taking more risks and you're becoming more reckless and more irresponsible with every step that you're taking.
Yeah,
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And I think people forget that was so spot on, Alexander, as usual, spot on. I think most people don't realize when you ask, what is the US dollar backed by? Most people can't answer that question. The answer is debt and military force. Of course, in the 1970s, when the US took the US dollar off of the gold standard, it is now backed by debt. We are a debt-based economy. And the only way to secure American hegemony is to shore up and make sure the US dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. Well, when you start to see over the past, number of years, the solidification of these BRICS nations around mineral resources and commodities, it's interesting that as the United States was shutting down nuclear reactors and allowing green activists and so forth to shut down nuclear reactors, and with no uranium production virtually at all in the United States, zero, Vladimir Putin was doing the opposite, which is not only controlling every leg of the stool, that is the exploration, the production, the refinement, and in tandem with Kazakhstan, you literally have this power center of commodities and resources that you don't have any longer in the West. They're sitting on them. They just won't do anything with them. And now there's this realization that, oh shit, the only thing we can do is maybe go after them and try to, usurp power from Russia. So it was a sanctions war. And it's interesting to look at all of the sanctions plan: oil, gas, coal. And yet then of course, one of the only things missing from that is uranium. And with one fell swoop, literally, Putin could turn off the lights in the West. And so there's this, to me, that is one of the most underreported, underdiscussed things, is the idea of what exactly Alexander's talking about. This is a sanctions war. It's about hegemony. It's about power. It's about the US dollar as a reserve currency of the world. And you're seeing, like, to Gonzalo's point, this like last gasp of like trying to shore up and make sure that the US dollar remains strength. And then this week, you literally saw the Treasury Department come out in the United States and run up against this debt ceiling, $31.4 trillion in debt. So now we need to borrow more money from the Chinese in order to pay Social Security benefits in the United States. Wrap your head around that for a second. We need to borrow from China in order to pay Social Security benefits. Like, who's in command here? It's certainly not. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and remember when Al Gore used to talk about the Social Security lockbox? There is no such lockbox. It's a pay-as-you-go scheme. Yeah. And now the contributors are not enough to shore up the payments that are due. There's the thing that my thinking into the future, because I'm always, I'm a speculator in all these forms of my life, and I always try to pay attention to the future and come up with all kinds of crazy ass dreams about what's to come. And my thinking at this point is that, Clayton, to your point of the United States dollar being backed by nothing but debt, well, it's faith, but also inevitably we have to look at the petrodollar. And the fact that the Saudis are decisively turning away from the United States because they see the mess that they've created, and they are turning towards China. We had that big meeting in Medina with Xi Jinping and all the other Arab leaders, quite apart from MBS himself. And you realize that if Saudi goes decisively towards the East, towards Russia, towards China, and it's in their interest to do so, quite frankly, that's why MBS is doing it. I think that, frankly, the Americans, rather than mess around with Ukraine and the Russians, they might realize that they have to start doing something about Saudi Arabia. That's the issue that I think is sort of like next on the menu. Alexander, would you agree?
Absolutely. Now, can I just talk about Saudi Arabia? Before I do that, can I just, come off a few more from the points that Clayton was making? Because, of course, the single most powerful coercive instrument that the United States, and by the way, the EU, the collective West, if you have have had to sustain dollar hegemony and the West's domination of the economic system. Obviously, military power has played a big role, and one should never underestimate that. But the biggest single instrument has been sanctions. The idea that you can use sanctions to level economies, you can starve them of resources, you can create massive inflation problems. Now, what's happened is they've used their sanctions weapon, their nuclear weapon, if you like. They used that. They actually talked about the nuclear weapon, cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT. That's the nuclear equivalent in sanctions terms. They did that last year, and it hasn't worked. And I think that is driving them mad, actually, because to an extent that is perhaps not appreciated, if the West cannot crush economies, I say the West, I mean, you know, the collective West, the people who run things at the moment, not talking about everybody in the West, the collective West can't crush economies in the way that they've done up to now, how are they going to keep this whole thing propped up? How are they going to keep the reserve currency situation? I mean, you know, we use the reserve currency. If you don't do as we say, you are not going to be able to trade in dollars, and that will be disastrous for you. If somebody shows, well, actually, it's not so disastrous, we can get by, and not only get by, but we can actually trade with other people in our own currency and their own currency. And we don't have to use Swift, actually. We can use our own messaging systems. And we don't have to use your insurance companies, because insurance plays a huge role up to now. Very recently, 90% of shipping supposedly is insured in London. But of course, it turns out that it doesn't all have to be insured in London. In fact, be insured in other places. Well, this is something that is potentially existential. Emmanuel Todd, by the way, who is a French anthropologist, I've called him in the past a sociologist, but I gather he's an anthropologist. But you know, somebody who has written very, very eruditely about these matters. He has made this precise point. He's the first person, I think, to have made it. He said that if you're talking about Russia and America as the two conflicting parties in this, yes, this war is existential for the Russians. If they lose it, then, I mean, their position is going to be severely threatened. But to an extent that perhaps is not widely understood, but I think it is understood at elite levels, this is now becoming existential for the United States as well, for its position as the dominant economic financial power, able to coerce others, forcing them to trade on its terms, to cover its deficits, its budget deficits, its trade deficits, enabling the United States to borrow money in its own currency, making it possible for the United States to sustain these enormous military budgets that it has, and do all of these various other things that we've been talking about. So it is becoming existential in that respect. Now, coming to the Saudis, because the other a point that is often overlooked about the reserve currency of the position of the dollar is that, of course, it's got many different causes. I mean, it's not, you can't reduce it to just one. But the petrodollar historically has been an important linchpin to this, because oil remains the single most widely traded commodity. And it's not just the single most widely traded commodity. It is the commodity without which an industrial system cannot function. We may be moving towards alternative energy technologies, but we still need oil. Oil is still important. You can't do without oil. So if oil is sold in dollars, is bought and sold in dollars, then it means everybody has to have some dollars in order to buy that oil, without which their industries can't work. Now, the Saudis, back in the 70s, they were the dominant oil exporter. They said, on behalf of themselves and OPEC, we will trade oil in dollars. They're now saying something different.
Right.
They're now saying, well, actually, we're prepared to sell oil in any currency, euros, Chinese currency. This is a major blow, potential blow to dollar hegemony. And it is extremely worrying for the United States. And Gonzalo, you're absolutely right. They're going to pull every stop to stop this from happening. But the interesting thing is that there doesn't seem to be any visible dissent to this policy within Saudi Arabia or on the part of the other Gulf states. Now, that I think is indicative, because even with countries as controlled as these are, you would have expected by now that would be some visible signs of dissent. But so far there has not been. And that does make me wonder whether some kind of discussion has been going on within these countries, not just within Saudi Arabia, but within the other Arab oil producers, and whether they've come to a consensus about this, and that they're saying to themselves, well, look, this isn't working for us anymore in the way that it did, and we've got to start thinking beyond the dollar.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. Absolutely, is the petrodollar a major piece of this and trading in that? And of course, it's not. Is it wrong to say that it's not backed by oil in the sense that we don't have any oil left in the United States? When Joe Biden gets rid of, when we had 1-for-1 gold, right, as a gold standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
We knew what it was backed by. We knew that we had relatively speaking, an equal number of gold. There's a contention as to how much actually was there, and the auditing under Truman, what kind of auditing actually showed up. We don't. But nevertheless, it was the idea that there was a 1-for-1. Well, now that Biden has literally exhausted our strategic oil reserves, so what do we have to show for it as far as backing the U.S. dollar with oil as a 1-for-1? The only thing that really comes out, as to your point, is military, and that's one thing we've been talking about on our show for a long time: is military strength and sanctions.
Well, what's important to recognize
can I just make one quick point, which is the dollar has never been backed by oil.
Right.
The dollar has been backed by American power.
Right.
That is why the Saudis agreed to trade oil for the dollar, for dollars. Right. By doing that, they, of course, strengthened the dollar within the international financial system.
Bingo.
But ultimately, it's American power that underpinned it. American economic power, American military power. The reason the Saudis are moving away from that is because they sense that's fading, and they also sense that to the extent that it still exists, it's not working for them anymore, in the sense that it once did, and importantly, that there are now alternatives. There are alternatives in the Eurasian system, in China, in Russia, places that they can go to, where perhaps in the 1970s, realistically, the only game in town was the United States.
Yeah, because people don't know the history of it. It's very interesting. In August of 1974, just as Watergate was breaking, the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, William Simon, flew to Riyadh, and he cut a deal basically with the Saudis, because Nixon in 71 had taken the dollar off the gold standard. And by 74, the inflation was beginning to become rampant. And so the deal that Simon cut with the Saudi king at the time, and the Saudi leadership class generally, was that the United States would guarantee Saudi Arabia's, and really the House of Saud's, existence by way of American military power, on the condition that the Saudis would trade their oil in dollars, trade it, that is, sell it to third parties in dollars, and that the Saudis would invest their excedent dollars into treasury bonds. And see, that's the key issue, the treasury bonds, because it's the U.S. Treasury bond market that has propped up the American economy and allowed the United States to have this enormous debt. And by the way, you were mentioning that they have currently, the federal government's debt is $31.4 trillion. But that neglects three other asset classes that add on to that debt. That's agency debt, because each of the federal government agencies can issue its own debt. There's also state debt, and there's municipal debt. Municipal debt tends to be internal, but state and agency debt, you add that up, and you're talking really closer to about 45 trillion altogether. And so you're talking an enormous amount of debt that the United States is floating on. And it's been used to pay things like pensions, like Social Security, state employee pensions. And so what has happened is that because this debt was soaked up by the nations around the world, the United States could go on this spending spree and have commitments insofar as the welfare state, insofar as entitlements that are really beyond the scope of American governmental income in the form of taxes. But they were able to do this by issuing this debt at the federal, agency, and state levels. And so, the bill has come due. And quite frankly, my perception of this whole situation is that it really goes back to the global financial crisis of 2008, where the financial system and the American governmental debt problem really came to a head. But rather than fix it, they kick the can down the road. And here we are. And the can is finally too big to be kicked. And so I think that all of these factors are playing into this desperation on geopolitical level. And so that's why my thinking is that as the Saudis, as you gentlemen have mentioned, are pivoting away from the dollar towards other currencies, which they have announced, and it's very clear that those are its intentions, their intentions. The Americans will, quite frankly, I think that they will try to stage a color revolution in Saudi Arabia. I think that that's the next. That's why I think it's the next on their list, because of all these factors and their fear that really, if the global U.S. bond capital markets collapse because there's no longer faith and other currencies are being used to trade, then I think that the American system in the US would collapse into a hyperinflationary mess. And I think that that's what scares them domestically, which is the impetus for all these foreign adventures. Because as you mentioned, Alexander, the gentleman, the anthropologist you mentioned, he's correct. It is an existential problem for the United States. And I do not see a solution to this problem. Do either of you gentlemen think that there is a way for the Americans to muddle through and get out of this mess? Clayton?
Massive austerity, I think. I again, to your point, the bill is due. And you have all of these pension systems that are collapsing. I mean, it's being held together with duct tape. And I think you're right about the 2008 financial collapse. They never allowed it to. They never allowed its.
They never took the hit. They never let it just go through.
I don't know if you guys have this in the UK, but there's a thing called in the United States called Imodium, which is something you take when you've got like you've got some stuff going on, in your lower body, and it's really bad because it blocks you up. Right. And you shouldn't block you up. When you got a virus, it should clean it out. You should clean it out with water. You should get it rid, get it out of your system. And that's exactly what they did. The Federal Reserve became like Imodium, blocking it up and not allowing it to collapse. No one went to prison in the United States as a result of the financial. No one. I mean, look at Iceland. Look what happened in Iceland, right? So you have a complete difference in when you have these people doing what they did and government then collapsing under the weight of itself, declaring back. So the United States never went through this catharsis, never had this cleansing.
The IMF never put the U.S. on an austerity program.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And they never were forced to, atone for their sins. And of course, they just added more to their, the Federal Reserve never cleansed its balance sheets from 2008. They still had multiple, huge level of balance on their balance sheets when this next round occurred. So when the pandemic hit, they just added on more and more and more. And now the Federal Reserve is backed into a corner as we head into a 2024 election cycle in the United States. Because now you're going to see interest rates dropping, which they have now for four months consecutively on the mortgage front. So now you're going to see this pent up demand for housing. People are going to go back and start to buy. But the underlying foundation of all of this is still there. This isn't going away. They're going to start to print more money through quantitative easing, which is what's going to happen. They're going to shore things up to make sure that as we head into 2024, things are fine and interest rates will drop and they will never fix the problem. I don't know how this ends without total collapse. I mean, Jared Diamond is right,
Well, can I just say, of course, because in Europe, we've actually been here. And what you're both gentlemen describing, in my opinion, and I live in the former imperial capital. The thing to understand now, empire, I think, is not the wrong word to describe this. It's the cost of empire. The cost of empire is that it atrophies your domestic economy. It happened to Spain in the 17th century. Gonzalo, you come from a country which was supplying the silver that kept the Spanish budget running, even as the Spanish Habsburgs were ignoring what was going on in Spain itself. The fact that conditions were becoming unproductive because all this huge input of silver was creating inflation within Spain. And so wealth was becoming concentrated. The population in Spain was becoming immiserated. There was an enormous amount of inequality and division. And of course, it all collapsed eventually in the mid 17th century. The whole thing just went, down. And you have exactly the same thing has happened in Britain. Britain took it even further than Spain, because in the mid 19th century, Britain was the great industrial power. I mean, the workshop of the world. But of course, with wealth pouring into Britain, and of course, what to understand about wealth that comes from empire is that it is very unevenly distributed. It means that the ruling elites benefit massively, and they lose interest in maintaining, in preserving the domestic vitality of their societies, because they don't have to. They can do that. They can bring in this wealth from India, from Malaysia, from the West Indies, from all sorts of places, all the far-flung corners, South Africa, all the far-flung corners of Britain's great empire. And the result was that British manufacturing started to lose ground. It began to decay, it began to stagnate, productivity growth became low, inequality increased, there was labor unrest in Britain. We have never escaped these problems in Britain, because to this day, productivity in British industries are very low. And the reason is that British industries, Britain's economy was for so long propped up by the profits of empire. And I think this is what the United States is doing. So the point about empire is that it weakens the core in the end. It
Right.
means that there are some people who benefit from it and who keep it going. And those people, of course, they become inordinately obsessed in geopolitical games. The British were as well, by the way, controlling, this province of Punjab, running this part of West Africa, doing all of these sort of things. If you read British history, which of course I'm very familiar with, you will know how, to what an extent London in, say, 1900 was fixated with these things.
Right.
Even as industries were dying in Britain, where they were not up to dealing with competition from the United States and from Germany. And of course, it also creates a kind of, and this is something which I find very strange that's happened in America, because in America, it seems to be the elite class has to a great extent adopted English fashions and mores. And of course, what happened in Britain was that the manufacturing elite, the business people, the factory owners, they adopted aristocratic manners. So, they built these big country houses, and they had their Daimler and Rolls-Royce cars, and they sent their children to minor public schools, and they pretended that they were aristocrats, even if they weren't. And they weren't at the same time concerned about their factories. They weren't investing in them. They weren't doing what Americans were doing at that time, organizing trusts, or what Germans were doing, which was organizing cartels and setting up institutes to find out these things. And it seems to me this is what's now overtaking the United States. And
Yeah.
the result is you replace debt with, in place of production, you have debt instead. Instead of activity, real economic activity, you have financial engineering.
Yeah, and there's also another issue that I've noticed that, and Alexander, perhaps you would know this, the history, because I'm unfamiliar with it, but in the current global American empire, there is a weird notion in among the elite class of demonizing the very people who created the wealth of the United States. I mean, it's very obvious that there is a deep-seated resentment, almost hatred, towards the white working classes in the United States. I don't want to get into the whole the racial woke nonsense, because that's just a rabbit hole that's not very interesting. But the leadership class hates the heartland of the United States, which is the source of the productivity of the country and the wealth of the country. You see what I'm saying?
We have the same. We have exactly the same in Britain. I mean, Bernard Shaw, and this is way back in the 20s. He said the two Englishmen only have to listen to each other speak with their different accents in order to hate each other. And I mean, and it's still true. I mean, we have this horrible word that it's not so much used anymore, but a couple of years ago it was chaff, which is what elite Londoners, how they refer to working class people. And of course, if you go back before that to 19th century and 18th century England, of course, that didn't exist then. It was a much more egalitarian system, despite the fact, that there were the great aristocrats and all of this, but they interconnected much better. And then, of course, from about the mid-19th century, you saw these social differences start to intensify, and this gulf starts to grow, because ultimately, this is again the point, the elite becomes disconnected from the vital life of the country which it leads, because it's immersed in its empire, if you like, and at the same time, it's much more interested in its geopolitical games. And if you're an aristocrat in Britain running a province in India, well, you get on with the Maharajas there, or you get on with the chiefs in West Africa. You're much more engaged with those sort of people than you are with your industrial workers back home.
It's interesting. You talked about the late, and the early part of the 1900s, and the similarities to what the United States is doing now. We don't call it empire, although that's exactly what it is. We won't call it. You can draw parallels to the Boer War. Between the British in South Africa, South Africa in 1899, what to 1902, 1901, 1902, and to shore up British strength in that region. But we're doing the exact same thing. We just don't call it that in the United States. So we're there helping in Somalia. We're there helping in Syria to guard their oil, but we're actually stealing their oil. We're there to help all of these. We're moving into Haiti in order to help the Haitians. We're doing all of these things, but we don't want to call it empire because we have such a bad taste in our mouth in the United States for calling it that. But we still do it. And you're right, the meddling of all of these geopolitical messes that the United States finds itself in. I mean, find me a famine around the world that the United States isn't somehow involved in or responsible for, right? I mean, look what's happening at the border in the United States right now. The pouring of Nicaraguans coming across the border into the United States. Who has created the unrest inside of Nicaragua, right? So we create these messes, and then now we're seeing the direct result inside the United States as a result of all of this geopolitical meddling around the world.
Yeah. Well, this is actually very.
What's remarkable is that the American leadership class, the thing that strikes me is that they are so incompetent. I mean, for people who have gotten, big Ivy League degrees and whatnot, and worked at the Rand Corporation and Harvard and all the rest of it, they're morons. They don't seem to see that if you do this, this is the inevitable result, or a panoply of possible results, and you have to plan for these possible results. They don't seem to understand that there are causal chains insofar as any policy or action that you pursue. That's the thing that strikes me. I'm sorry, Alexander,
Yes.
you were saying?
Well, what I was going to say, actually, Gonzalo, is I think that Clayton actually provided something of a clue to this, because this is where I think that the United States is unique, in that it is running an empire whilst at the same time simultaneously being in denial about this. Because, of course, the United States, in its origins, and Americans, and I think they have a right to be very proud of the way in which their nation was founded. It was founded as an anti-imperialist, a rebellion against the king. And it came up with a constitution which says that, it sets out we the people of the United States, and the Declaration of Independence talks about all men, I think, being created equal, things of that kind. that is, of course, completely inconsistent with running the kind of imperial system that we are talking about. And that creates an extraordinary dissonance, because it means that whereas, the Count Duke of Olivares in the 17th century in Spain could plan his strategies quite openly, he could talk about them in the court of Philip IV and, plan things straightforwardly, and there would be discussions in the Spanish State Council. And if you're talking about Britain, Joseph Chamberlain could do the same in London. Could be absolutely open because he was proud of the fact that he was running an empire. In America, everything has to be done covertly. It can't be openly spoken about. It can't just straightforwardly say, well, we're planning to control Nicaragua. This isn't something that in America you're able to do.
Right.
So the result is nothing can be thought through because it can't be openly discussed. Everything has to be done inside the sort of secret underbelly, if you like, of the American political elite. Now, at some level, of course, discussions do take place, but it's much more difficult, and you can't call in experts. You can't, because the British people, that's the other paradox. It's one of the things about Britain was that not only did we have an empire, but many people in Britain were proud of the fact that we had an empire. So we could talk about things that Britain had to do, but you can't do it in the same way in the United States. And one consequence of that, by the way, is why it is so, comes back to an earlier point that you were making, Gonzalo, why America has to demonize its enemies to the extent that it does. You can't have a situation where, like you did with Britain, where, Chetwale, the Zulu chief, has, he fights the British, he's defeated eventually by the British after a terrible war, but he's then invited to Windsor Castle and has tea with Queen Victoria. You can't do that in America because, of course, if America is up against someone, Putin or whoever, they have to be Lucifer's representative on Earth, because that's the only way that you can mobilize support or at least rationalize within the United States what you're doing.
Yeah.
And there's actually, I'm sorry, Clayton, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say to your point about these, if we asked Americans these questions straightforwardly about, do you think that the United States should be, funneling this amount of money into Ukraine, or doing X, Y, and Z in Somalia, or taking over Nicaragua, or invading Haiti, which is, of course, what they've been wanting to do and getting international support for an invasion of Haiti. Most Americans, if they knew what they were up to and they were straightforwardly asked if they would want that, they would absolutely say no. They would absolutely say, no, we don't want that. If they knew most Americans have no idea what we've been doing in Yemen, what we've been doing in Syria, what we've been doing in Somalia, what we've been doing in God knows wherever else. I mean, and if we knew about it, we would say absolutely not, but it's kept quiet, hidden, and blocked, and they're not allowed to know about it.
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right, Clayton. And the thing that strikes me about what Alexander is saying is, the unwillingness to see objectively that the United States has become an empire leads to this hypocrisy, and leads to this Manichaean view of the world. Us, we are good; them, they are all evil. And their motivations. This is the interesting part to me, that the Americans dismiss the rational motivations of their opponents, and rather than work with them, they just bully them. And this has actually been the modus operandi of the Americans since the end of the Second World War, quite apart from the Cold War. But in other countries, it was sort of like a bullying attitude. Certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the unipolar world, that has definitely been the approach, always bullying and never looking at the motivations, the rational motivations of their opponents. And so instead of working with them and trying to find a peaceful resolution, or at least a compromise that works for everyone, they just roll in bully-like, flatten the place, and declare victory. I think that they have been repeating this approach with all of their opponents, especially after 1991. But now we've reached a point where it is just not possible, because the Russians aren't going to stand for being rolled over in the way that the United States has done with other countries like Iraq, Libya, Syria, and what have you.
I think I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave in a moment. I just wanted to say something about the United States has never been terribly good at diplomacy, and there's a historical and very simple geographical reason for this. Historically, the United States has dominated its immediate neighborhood. It's been protected by the oceans. It's not had to deal with neighbors who are as powerful or more powerful than itself. So it's not had to develop this great tradition of diplomacy that we used to see in Europe. So the Americans have never been particularly good at diplomacy. And I think that's a fair comment about this.
Yeah,
but right. It has got much worse recently. And I think one of the reasons is that as American power is slipping, they feel that they have to assert themselves even more in order both to achieve whatever outcome they want to achieve, but also to reassure themselves that they are able to be, that they're still the dominant
what it reminds me
force.
of? It reminds me of a toddler. Toddlers cry and freak out and throw things because they can't communicate.
Yes.
Right. And that's exactly what's here. They can't communicate, to your point. They can't be diplomatic. They don't have strong diplomacy. And so they push and they show force. And that's what they've been doing. And to right back to the Saudi Arabian point at the very beginning, it's exactly what's happening here.
Absolutely. My friends, my very good friends, I'm afraid I have to leave at this point, but I was longer here than I expected because this has been such an amazing discussion. Thank you again, Gonzalo and Clayton. Let's definitely stay in touch.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love to have you on.
Thank you very much for hosting.
Thanks, Alexander.
Absolutely. Right. Bye.
Oh, there he goes. I should have told chat to bid farewell to our guest with a +1 on chat, but next time. Clayton, now that you and I are alone together at last, it was a delight having Alexander, by the way, and I hope you have him on your show because he's.
I would love to.
Yeah. The thing I want to turn to is American. Since we've been talking about the global American empire. We inevitably, you start obsessing about the leadership class of the global American empire. And, all these revelations are coming out about misplaced documents and classified documents and so forth and so on, insofar as Joe Biden is concerned, Joe Biden personally. I think that this is an effort by the deep state, by the entrenched bureaucracy and certain political players in the background to get rid of Joe Biden. And to replace him, perhaps with Kamala Harris, and there are other people, Joe Buttigieg, I forget his first name, Pete Buttigieg, or Gavin Newsom, God help us all.
Yeah.
My appreciation, looking at it from thousands of miles away, is that with all of this wall-to-wall mainstream media coverage, it's a signal that they're ready to get rid of Joe Biden. Joe has to go. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Mine as well, and I've said it on our show. I've said it now for, most recently I said it maybe 3 weeks ago. And I said, look, this may sound like a conspiracy theory, but the fact that these documents are showing up, I don't know if I said it 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, when this story first broke about these documents, I said, this whole thing smells fishy to me. And the fact that they were discovering these documents in multiple locations, and suddenly the coordinated discussion about them was being rolled out. CNN has the story first. Really? Again, CNN, the only way it gets this information is directly from the intelligence community, right? They get it from their inside deep state intelligence community, the permanent government, right? When I say deep state, this is not conspiratorial. It's the permanent government. It's the permanent unelected government that stays there, will be there long after Biden is gone, has been there for 50 years. It's permanent. So I absolutely believe that that's the case. I think it's clear that these documents were planted. It was an easy out for them to, and this is, when he said he was going to run for 2024, I think you saw some real fear in the Democratic Party. Like, oh shit, how do we respond to this? How do we really? He's going to run.
So you think that was it? That was the trigger?
I think in recent weeks, we heard him say without a doubt that that's the case. We heard that from the podium of the White House that that's the case. But I also think you're seeing concerns around his resolve in certain military conflicts. And I think that's also a concern. Remember, they want a permanent war. They want a permanent military incursion in these places. They want the money to keep flowing for the deep state wants this. So when you hear differences of opinion from inside Washington about certain military actions, for instance, Trump, right? They didn't want Trump in there, right? Clearly
not.
Clearly, they didn't want Trump in there. The deep state didn't, and you certainly saw that fracturing over Afghanistan, and of course, in other instances. So I don't know that was the case. I think this has probably been in the works for a while. I mean, but it's clear that they don't want him there, and I don't think Kamala Harris. I think that that would be a failure. I think who they will probably want there is what you said, is Gavin Newsom. That's been my prediction. Is they will put Gavin Newsom in there, who's driven California into the toilet. That's exactly who they want to carry out these globalist agenda on, on everything that he's been pushing in California. He's the perfect Democrat for them right now.
He's the perfect front. Because it seems to be like really a puppet. I mean, my thinking, reading the tea leaves, and this is pure speculation on my part, but my thinking has been that we all know that Kamala Harris is really the finger puppet of Barack Obama. And Barack Obama, unlike any other previous president, is neck deep into the little schemes and the little plots that they're carrying out behind the scenes.
Right.
And it seems to me that, the reason that Kamala was picked was because Obama wanted it. That's very clear. And her career is because of him and the people around her who handle her. They're all Obama people. And so but at the same time, Ron Klain, the chief of staff of Biden, is he is an Obama figure, I believe, right? I can't recall offhand, but it's not important.
Yeah.
The point is, it seemed to me that, Joe, they wanted to get the Obama faction wants to get rid of him to put in Kamala. But there are other factions, the Clintonista factions, who want their guy too. And you're thinking that they're going to settle on Gavin Newsom, because I remember a couple of years ago they kind of like trial ballooned Pete Buttigieg. Remember those photos when he and his husband, Smirk, presented the world with their two babies, which were adopted or purchased or what have you. And it was so funny, that picture of the two of them there sitting with these two babies, and they both had like hospital bracelets, the kind of bracelet that you get when you are checked into a hospital, like with new mothers. And they're just picking up a couple of kids, like you'd go and get the groceries. I mean,
right? Like they've been through labor the past 3 days, getting a C-section, and like tell that to my wife, who was in the hospital for days, and could barely walk after a pinched nerve after giving birth, right? But they got bracelets because they suffered, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so they trial ballooned him. He was a bust, and so I'm wondering, at this point, how are they going to, because I agree with you that they want to put Gavin Newsom, or at least several factions of the deep state and the backroom politicos, like the Clintonistas and what have you, want to put Gavin Newsom. I'm wondering how the hell they're going to get rid of Kamala, because with Nixon, they got rid of Spiro Agnew by way of income tax stuff and the land deal in Maryland, right?
Right.
And so that's how they got Gerald Ford, who was one of the deep
Warren
state
Commission.
And so how are they going to put Gavin Newsom? I mean, wouldn't they have to get rid of Kamala first? I mean, it would be insane to have Joe Biden, then Kamala Harris for a year or so, and then get rid of her and put in Gavin Newsom. I mean, how do you figure that they're going to achieve this goal? Which I agree,
money.
That's their goal.
Money, and I think just look at George Soros and the millions that George Soros has funneled to Gavin Newsom. So, I think and not just to Gavin Newsom, but all sort of pro Newsom PACs and so forth. So I think it'll come down to money and power. That's where
the mechanics, I can't imagine it. I mean, It's like we're watching a TV show and we're trying to figure out what the next episode is going to be. You know what I mean?
You know what's interesting, because I don't think they always have, you know, I think sometimes, and I think you're hitting on this, we give them too much credit for having thought about this like three-dimensional chess many years in advance. And I think in many ways they have a lot of these pieces in place that they think. And you mentioned Ronald Clayton, of course, who, yes, was an Obama aide. He was a Clinton aide as well, right? These deep state, these people that are sort of permanently there and part of this process. But I think that they give money to these people and they almost like let them fight it out. We're gonna have a primary. There's going to be a primary, whether you like it or not. And so I think in many ways it's a testing ground. They will give money to Newsom in a big way. And if he shoots himself in the foot, then they've got Kamala, who's right there and can also do their bidding. Because you see, Kamala is very much, she's like tofu. As you saw, she absolutely absorbed everything, right? Yeah. She has none of her own political opinions. She's all absorbing whatever is necessary at the moment. So she is like a sponge. She is like tofu. She will absorb the flavor of whatever they want. So I feel like they feel like, okay, we got her, but she's been a disaster. So let's funnel as much money we can to Newsom. We will have a primary, and now it's not starting in Iowa anymore. We will see how Gavin Newsom does in South Carolina first, and we will see how this. And by the way, I should mention, you know, as a student of history, you know, in political history specifically, it's very rare, actually. I mean, most of our presidents of the United States end up, at least in modern times, have been governors, right? Mm-hmm. It's very rare.
You're right.
You know, if you think about it, it's rare for senators. Almost no senators are ever elected president of the United States. It's very rare. John F. Kennedy being one of them. Of course, Joe Biden being another. But it's very rare for this to happen, Senator Obama, but almost never. So governors end up having the machinery in place to make it happen. So I think Gavin Newsom is probably right there in the driver's seat. And I think he's going to we'll see. I don't know. We'll see. But what he's done in California has been an absolute train wreck.
But do you think that Biden will finish out his term, or will they get rid of him before 2024?
I've said that he will not finish out his term. I've said that from the very beginning. When he was elected, I said he will not finish out his term. That's just my, pie in the sky prediction on this. I don't think I just don't think he's going to make it, either politically or physically. I just don't think he's going to make it. And kind of in the beginning, I thought until Kamala Harris got, really run over by the Democratic Party, that he would have stepped aside and she would become the first female president. And then there would always be that asterisk, right? Because to be the first female president of the United States, she would be unelected, right? Yeah. She would be unelected, and it would be because of a resignation or some sort of political fallout that she would become president of the United States. And so I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that do you think he'll ride out into 2024?
That's a good question. Physically, that's a big issue because he is clearly deteriorating, and people have done these graphs of showing how many days he's had off and whatnot. I mean, the majority of his time has been resting because the poor man. I mean, whatever you think of Joe Biden, and I personally despise him. When I first came across him and paid attention to him back in '91 with the Clarence Thomas hearings, I just despised him. He just seemed like clearly, put in place there because of the credit card companies in Delaware, and just an awful human being. I mean, just despicable. But as a human being, as a man, I look at this decrepit elderly gentleman, and I feel truly sorry for him because, I mean, God knows what concoction of pills and amphetamines or what have you they're filling him up to get him on stage, right?
Right.
But
every day to try to prop that guy up. I mean, he's like a skin suit right now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see him visibly deteriorating, right? And I think it was cruel at this point to have had him do a press conference where he actually had to take questions, and he looked. I mean, it was just sad. And that, for me, was a big signal that they are getting ready to get rid of him. That they wanted people to see how decrepit and incompetent he is, and how he has deteriorated physically so much. And so I personally think that physically he might not make it, okay? And I think that actually that would be the easiest way to get rid of him, as opposed to doing like a big political fight over these documents or whatnot. But I don't think that he's going to make it because physically, but also, as you said, the political support. I don't think that there's anybody there who really supports him. And I think that there's a general consensus that really the Biden family, all they want is to avoid indictments. That's all they want.
Mhm.
And I think that that might be used as leverage to say, okay, Joe, step aside gracefully, say that your health is deteriorating and whatnot, and we won't indict your family. And I
Right.
think that that might be the play to get rid of him. But the replacement would have to be Kamala, because I don't see them having the time to lay the groundwork to get rid of Kamala, bring in Gavin Newsom, and present him as the new de facto unelected president. So there would have to be a period of time where Kamala is president. And of course, that would mean that the Obama faction would be hell-bent for leather on winning the 2024 election. And so therefore, we would have this battle, this royal battle between the Kamala faction, which is really the Obama faction, and the other people, the Clintonistas and what have you, supporting Gavin Newsom, the Soros crowd and all that. And so it would be it could be a civil war among the Democrats between Newsom and Kamala Harris. How it will play out, I don't know. I mean, that's why it's like better than any Mexican soap opera, and I've seen a few.
Right. Well, I mean, you could have Hakeem Jeffries too, minority leader of the House of Representatives. That could be another big piece of this too, Hakeem Jeffries. And so who can they position in these places right now, these chess pieces, to see who can carry out the needs and wants of the deep state? I know that, Kamala Harris certainly has been able to carry the water for them. She's not an effective mouthpiece though. And so, but if your mouthpiece currently is literally mentally incapacitated and can't speak anymore, then clearly you have to put somebody in place who can. And on the world stage right now, I think there was a really telling moment when, and we talked about the Saudi Arabian piece of this earlier, which is when you're openly mocked by the Saudis and for not even being able to complete a sentence, which is what they were doing, that's embarrassing. And that's embarrassing to the deep state inside of Washington as well. And so when you have a president who is openly mocked by the Saudis because of his mental capacity, that's a problem. And so I think you're right on the indictment front too. That's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, what leverage they have over him. And we'll see. It doesn't seem like they have currently been able to do much. They've been ignoring. They've been ignoring what the Hunter Biden story. They haven't been going on too deeply on that. They've been much more concerned about going after Donald Trump. Did we lose Gonzalo? I think we might have lost Gonzalo. Hey, everyone in the chat. Sorry to be the only one here. Much love to all of you guys. I hope you're enjoying the discussion. I'm having a great time. Thank you guys so much. I was telling Gonzalo I have to run in a little bit because I've got an interview that I'm doing on January 6th. I have to do that story, really some unbelievable stories coming out that people haven't heard about the January 6th events of that day. Someone who was there who had the FBI show up at his house. And so I'm going to be doing that interview here in a few minutes. But great to see everyone. 6-0. Nice to see all you guys in the chat. Bucky John Duma. Start rocking and rolling. I don't have my guitars up here. Oh, I do over there, but they're not plugged in. Good to see you. I would love to. Shea Ray's Rebellion. Shay's Rebellion did nothing wrong. Big Red says Gonzalo got hit by a CIA operative. No, hope not. I think he just had some crazy internet there, dealing with some crazy internet stuff there. And Constantinian says Clayton's voice is warming. Thank you very much. I'll tell my wife that when she yells at me about something, or when we get in an argument about something, I'll be like, I want to calm you down with my soothing voice. And she'll say, what? I'll say, hey, Constantinian in the chat said that my voice was warming. And she'll say, well, Constantinian, he is in a war zone after all. I was literally doing an interview right before this with a scholar, a PhD in Tehran. And for 45 minutes, we were dealing with her internet access in Tehran. And so just really difficult. So
sorry about that.
No worries. How's your internet there? And how do you, I'm curious. Curious what your
Yes.
internet's like there in
It's
Kharkov.
so efficient and so fantastic. See, I only drop out just like 3-4 times per hour. I'm so sorry about that. Chat, please excuse me. And Clayton, thank you so much for taking over the show while I was, incommunicado.
No worries.
It's the goddamn internet. I don't know what the hell is going on. We do have the situation here in Kharkov. I'll give you some local color. Because of the Russian missile strikes all across the Ukrainian energy grid, which is they're destroying it or have been hitting the energy grid consistently in order to interrupt the train system, which is how the Ukrainian army is moving tanks and gear and men from place to place. And so Kharkov is kind of like out of the way of the overall central grid. But yet it has been struck repeatedly. And basically, I would say that something like roughly 60% of the city gets electricity. There are buildings, office buildings and such, non-essential buildings that have no electricity whatsoever. And in a lot of these buildings, it's become so cold, and I had to go to a couple of them, office buildings, that, inside there's no heating, because without electricity, there's no heat. And so the priority is, of course, to make sure that dwellings, residential dwellings, apartment buildings, and so forth, have heat. And so they get priority insofar as electricity is concerned. And so office buildings of various sorts, including some government buildings, have no heat whatsoever. And so, like, the toilets have frozen.
Oh my gosh! Oh yeah,
I mean, literally,
look,
yeah. Right? Like frozen solid, and you have no idea what kind of damage that must have done to the piping system. I mean, the infrastructure damage has been enormous, and it's really the toll is only going to come due come the spring or come peacetime, when a lot of these buildings are just not going to have any kind of sewage or water supply of any sort. And it's been a little bit of a nightmare in that regard. And so
they won't know, and they won't know the damage of the piping until they start running water through it again, right? And that's when it's going to be a disaster, as you point out, in the spring, when actual water can start flowing through these pipes again after they have electricity, and then they can see the extent of the freezing and the damage for these pipes that have not had warm water flowing through them. It's going to be
and you got to keep in mind the big problem is a lot of these offices, all kinds of office buildings today, the sprinkler systems in the ceilings, they have water pressurized right up to the nozzle, because of course they have to be able to release water the second a fire is detected. And so all of those fairly thin pipes, they're all going to burst. It's going to be a nightmare.
Wow.
And so it's I mean, it's going to be a whole shit show in that regard come the springtime. And it's the way it is. I wanted to bring in one of my Patreon supporters to ask a question or comment. Coffee 2XS, how's it going? And good to have you on.
Having coffee 2XS right now.
Me too. I just finished my
cheers. Cup. Yeah, cheers. So what's on your mind, man?
Well, I can't buy whole beans in America anymore, so this is getting critical.
I'm sorry, what do you mean you can't buy whole beans?
Well, you go to the supermarket, you have a choice between the red can of coffee and the blue can of coffee. And we used to get like all kinds of different whole bean coffees from single origins, like Ethiopian.
What state or city are you at, just to know?
All of them. I drive a truck, and I drive from Oklahoma to right now I'm out in the Dakotas. And so I go to this very well-known great big retail. That's who I'm driving for. Mm-hmm. And I can park at all of them, and they don't have coffee other than just brands. These come and go expensive brands, and even they don't sell whole bean coffee. Nobody sells whole bean single origin. And this big retailer used to sell different like Ethiopian coffee or Sumatran coffee or Brazilian coffee, and it's gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. So I'm on my last, I've got like enough to make maybe a couple more cups, and then I'm going to have to
get
use the red can.
I mean, this is really fascinating. And
it'd be like Kharkov. One of the things,
well, we have coffee here. We have coffee here.
You have Nescafe there. Believe me, I've
No,
been there.
no. I mean, like we have like actual coffee. I can show you the things, but I've stocked up. But anyway, the point I want to know, you're a trucker, and Clayton, please have a little patience because I want to have something. As a trucker, you are. What are the biggest changes that you have seen over the last few months that you're like, whoa, this is not normal? Apart from coffee, obviously.
Clayton did a show and he's talking about the fuel reserves, and at that time, the fuel reserves were supposed to run out in Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a misconception. The fuel reserve is horribly low. And Biden is like out of his freaking mind. But our fuel reserves are to the point where at any given time, we are less than a month at any given time of completely running out of diesel. And people generally think that electricity comes out of the wall, water comes out of the tap, food comes from the supermarket, and gas comes from the pump. And they don't understand the logistics involved in how did the supermarket get the food? How did the electricity get to your wall? And when we run out of diesel, it isn't just that you're not going to have lettuce in the supermarket. You're not going to have farming. Run out of diesel, and literally the country dies because you can't do these things with firewood.
No, you are the backbone. We've talked about this on our show. You are the backbone of the entire infrastructure, the trucking, what you guys do. And without you, we would be absolutely screwed. And we talk about, there's a great book called The Secret Life of Groceries. Most people, to your point, have no idea where the stuff comes from. They think that they can just go get avocados at the grocery store as if that's just, they were grown down the street. They have no,
well, you
people
have
are
to
so
go
far
to you have to go to Class Supermarket in Kharkov to get avocados anymore.
Wow. So yeah, coffee. Do you have a specific question for Clayton?
Actually, I just had a compliment I want to give to you or any independent journalist on this show, this format, or many others. Is I years ago I stopped watching news. I got red-pilled by a gorgeous lady. She was doing the unthinkable sin on YouTube of translating what Putin said because she grew up in an English Russian speaking household in New Zealand. And she understands the nuances of both English and Russian. And she got pissed off because she heard somebody saying that Putin was saying this and that. And she was sitting there, this is absolute bullshit. That's not what he said. So she made a YouTube video about it. Her name was Inessa S. And when I saw her, I found out that I was just handed so much crap that I finally got to the point where I will not be in a room with a television with the news on. I can't stand to be in the same room because what they're talking in the back of my head is like, what the hell is that crap? What do you mean Ukraine's going to win this war? Like, where do you get this stuff? And but independent journalists, here's the value of independent journalism. You guys in independent journalism live and die on your credibility. If you're an independent journalist and you're starting to spout off some weird bullshit, your viewership vanishes and you die.
Yeah.
And the big medias, they don't care about the credibility.
No,
they'll whine that people don't take them seriously, but why would anyone take like CNN or MSNBC or any of that crap seriously? Other than they're trying to spoon it into my head, but sorry, I won't go there.
Well, coffee,
you bring up a great point.
Go ahead, Clayton.
Well, I was going to say you bring up a great point because and we have to walk a fine line because there are stories that I get. I'm sure Gonzalo as well. I get hundreds of emails a day from people that say, Clayton, can you please cover this story? Can you please cover this story? And as we go more deeply into the story, it might sound to the blue-pilled masses that it's fake or it's not real or that it's conspiracy theory, but actually it really is true. But you walk a fine line because once you start to cover some of those stories, and you start to push the envelope, you're right. There are people that could say, oh crap. For instance, when we cover like UFO stories, right? Or I've spoken to high-ranking members of the, of the government and military, and the stuff that I know and have heard is unbelievable, right? And so once you start talking about some things that might sound almost tinfoil hat, you walk a fine line. So Coffee, you're right about that. Like this, you're on this, we're sort of on the razor's edge, but the mainstream media, they don't ever cover that stuff. They don't ever push the envelope. They just regurgitate the crap. They regurgitate the narrative.
The same thing.
Right, exactly. They're all saying the same thing.
Yeah. And the worst part is that that they are being driven by somebody's agenda. That they are just really propaganda tools. They're not interested in finding the truth or asking the difficult questions of people that ought to be, the difficult questions ought to be asked, but they are not asked because, people think that, journalists rather, they're afraid. They're afraid for their jobs. And so they toe the party line and spew out propaganda. Yeah. So Coffee, it's great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Okay. Hey, it was my honor, and I joined this because actually I need to speak with Gonzalo Lira privately somehow, but that's why I'm on Patreon. Eventually, I'll get to talk to you, but it's important. It's a personal issue, and it has to do with Harkov.
Okay. I'll look at for your message, and I'll respond to it. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And keep up
the
fight for freedom by doing this. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for spreading the message. Much love to you.
Very, very kind of you. Thank you. So listen, we've been going for about an hour and a half, and I know, Clayton, that you have a commitment, and so I don't want to keep you longer. I don't want you to miss your other commitment.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I've got an interview. I've got an interview coming up here in a few minutes, and my wife. I have a feverish, sick 6-year-old. That's hard to say, and so my wife has to run. My wife has to run and pick up her other daughter, and she's asking me to watch our sick little girl right now before my other interview starts on January 6th. So I've got that. So yeah, no, I appreciate it, but thank you so much for letting me sit in on the roundtable, and I had a great time, and I love your audience has been fantastic. I love everyone in your chat. So thank you for saying kind things and spreading the message.
So chat, please do me a favor and see out Clayton with a +1. I want to thank you, Clayton, very much. I hope you'll be in touch with Alexander because he's a great guy. I'm happy to give you his email so you can stay in touch. And chat, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the show. And Clayton, just stick around for a couple of minutes so I can say a couple of private words. And I will see you on what day is it? Today is Saturday. On Tuesday. I'm setting up the show. I don't have the guests just yet, but we'll find out who comes on Tuesday. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.